go. Okay. You're on. You're on, but I don't have a name. There we go. Elizabeth, you turn your mic on, Elizabeth?
Yep, I got it on.
All right, welcome. Good to see you.
Nice to see everyone.
Right. Lacey's mic is off on purpose. Yeah. Okay. Michael, welcome.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, I think we can start. It's 7:32, so some people will be coming on later, I suppose. There we go. All right. Well, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
I think you got muted by accident, Father Jack. Sorry about that.
Okay, we're back on. Good. Now you're muted, Lacey. All right. Anyways, tonight we're going to have Kathryn Getek Soltis, who is director of the Center for Peace and Justice Education at Villanova, and she's also assistant professor of Christian ethics. And so, as I told her, we're going to get her right on, and she can do her routine. All right. So, Kathryn, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you.
All right, go for it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Father Jack, and thank you to Lacey and everyone from the Office of Peace and Justice. This is really a great honor for me to be able to speak with you all tonight and share my reflections. So I appreciate the attendance and your engagement, and look forward to the conversation. For most of the last 20 years, I have had the privilege of going into prisons weekly or biweekly, sometimes as an educator, but mostly as a minister, either a chaplain or volunteer. And there is a bitter irony of this talk tonight on solidarity and prison ministry, given my own inability to go behind bars since March of last year. And frankly, it's been a very painful loss and leaves me feeling a bit lost at times. I never would have predicted it from the first 2 decades of my life, but having stumbled into this work shortly after college, I now feel at home with a particular vocation. As long as there are prisons, I feel the call to be in them. Granted, it is a privileged way I get to be in them. I can enter and leave on my own will. I am known by my own name and not a number. So I have not experienced incarceration, but I do feel a distinct call to remain close to those who do. In this last year, my body has been kept far off, but not my heart. And so I hope that these reflections can still be of some use, and that we can discern together tonight how we are all called as long as there are prisons. I'd like to begin with some stories, some images, really, about what prison ministry has looked like for me. It includes bringing Eucharist to a man slowly dying of hepatitis C in the prison medical unit. He's trying to make meaning of his life in one of the most dismal places that one could die. It includes a woman who I visit weekly, whose teenage daughter is by herself now in the apartment. But the woman incarcerated, the mother hasn't heard from her in weeks. She's frantic and powerless. It's about sitting around a metal picnic table on a unit, watching men patiently help the others who have trouble reading, assisting them as they offer the first or second reading for the communion service. It's about agreeing with a woman who pulls back her plastic chair from our little table and declares that it is the best church she's ever been to. It's about hearing the horrors of childhood abuse endured by a man who's now trying to explain to his 6-year-old daughter why daddy has been gone for so long. It's walking around on Ash Wednesday, seeing the ashes marking the foreheads of people incarcerated and the people who are incarcerating them. I come back to this last image quite a bit because it's the one day a year that a certain kind of solidarity is visible, made possible by our faith in common sinfulness, common call to repentance, a common promise of redemption. It's a jarring visual because everything else in that place is constructed to highlight difference and separation. Those with power and those who are thoroughly powerless. Those who are legally righteous and those who are legally guilty. It's a place where even clothes can be regarded as dangerous, where someone from the outside to leave a shirt somewhere, an incarcerated person could swap it out for a uniform and attempt to change his status. It seems the entire enterprise of incarceration is meant to undermine and question the possibility of solidarity. Indeed, is it even moral to pursue solidarity in these places of punishment? So tonight, I'd like to lift up this theme of Catholic social thought, solidarity, to help us think more about the nature of prison ministry and to think about what people of faith, especially in this country, are called to do and to be in the midst of mass incarceration. Solidarity demands that we not abandon life, and it makes claims on us to create the kind of society where the lives of all can flourish. So Lacey, if you want to start the PowerPoint, it just begins with what is the most frequently cited definition, which comes from the encyclical of Pope John Paul II, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, on social concerns. And it's probably familiar to many of you that solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, that is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. The next slide, we see in Fratelli Tutti that Pope Francis says, solidarity means much more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. It also means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, the denial of social rights. That bolded line is my own emphasis here because it makes clear why this is such an Augustinian matter of concern. In the fall, Augustinians, Brother Jeremy Hires and Father Paul Morrissey gave a wonderful presentation on prisons and prison ministry as part of this very webinar series. And in it, they quoted another of their brothers and my colleague, Father Kevin DePrinzio, who explained early on in this series that Augustinian values teach us that God created us for life in community. Next slide. So putting Father Kevin and Pope Francis together, which would be an amazing dinner table, Augustinian values teach us that God created us for solidarity. You can advance, Lacey. God created us for solidarity, for thinking and acting in terms of community. So these are all really great definitions, but they're not my favorite. My favorite definition of solidarity came from my daughter when she was 4 years old. We were preparing to attend a vigil at a family detention center in Berks County, Pennsylvania, here, one of a few facilities in this country where we lock up parents and children who come to this country seeking asylum. I explained to my daughter as we were preparing that these families were trapped and we didn't think that was right. But all day she was worried that it would happen to her. Mommy, I don't want to be trapped, she said. I explained that she was safe, but we needed to be there for those who weren't safe. But still, she said, "Mommy, I don't want to be trapped." At the vigil, we were kept across the street, but we could see the mothers and the young children who were playing in the outside yard. Many of them came to the fence and joined us in prayer and song from across the street. And as we left, my daughter said, "Mommy, I want to be trapped." I was so confused. Had I heard her wrong? Nope. She said, "Mommy, I want to be trapped so I can play with those kids." My favorite definition of solidarity. Seeing the goodness and dignity of human life, even across the barriers that we construct, and desperately wanting to be together, to be given back to each other. So this is the solidarity that I want to animate our conversation tonight as we think about the work of prison ministry and the work of us all to respond to the reality of incarceration. And there are two key features of solidarity that I want to lift out. And we can see them in the story from my daughter and from these definitions that arise out of Augustinian, charism and Catholic social thought. Next slide. So these two key features. First, that to speak of solidarity presumes the presence of difference and separation. We don't say solidarity unless that distance is actually there, that barrier is there. And the second, that solidarity is a virtue. It's an enduring disposition. My daughter could see that presence of difference and separation physically. We are citizens, they are not. We are free, they are held captive. We're held across the street. We had to act in response to that difference and separation. In terms of the virtue, well, that story with my daughter, it's a beginning. The question is she going to be the kind of person who wants to be trapped every day to be able to play with those kids? That's the goal. And that's a decision that she has to make in terms of what to do each day. An enduring disposition, not just a single act or single wish. These two aspects of solidarity, features of solidarity, are of course reflected in the divine solidarity of the Incarnation. The Incarnation speaks directly to the difference and separation between humanity and God, the reality of sin that alienates us from God. And we can see that it is also an enduring disposition because the Incarnation, that solidarity, is not just a single act, but who Christ is, who God is. God is the one who takes up flesh to be close to us, to enter into our chaos. It's not a principle of God, but God's very disposition. And it's worthy to note where the disposition of solidarity leads for God. It leads to Christ's arrest, trial, conviction, public humiliation as a criminal, brutalization in custody, and ultimately state-sanctioned capital punishment. All the things we do today in the name of so-called justice. So next slide. And we can see that solidarity there that I just mentioned. So in the next slide, I want to focus a little bit about this notion, this feature of solidarity in terms of the presumption of difference and separation, that it always speaks out into that. And sometimes that separation may be morally neutral. People are born in different parts of the world, speak different languages. There's difference. But sometimes that separation and difference is constructed, desired, and is morally problematic. And I believe that is what we are talking about when we talk of solidarity in the context of prison ministry, a constructed and morally problematic separation. The need for solidarity in this ministry is a result of the violation of human dignity and the inexcusable marginalization that structures our system of incarceration and punishment. I believe prison ministry can only be engaged with the understanding that incarceration is a social sin. Incarceration's very function is to exclude. It offers a myth that there is a kind of marginalization that is justified. You can click again. But there is no permissible marginalization in Catholic social thought. If we are to truly think and act in terms of community, no one can be left out. No one is disposable, as Pope Francis reminds us. It is easy to oppose marginalization when the outcasts are harmless, vulnerable, and grateful. But do we still actively oppose and resist marginalization when the outcasts have committed harm, when they are angry, volatile, even threatening? Catholic social teaching instructs us that we cannot uphold the dignity of a human life that we separate from society. This is the challenge of incarceration. We cannot justify it by saying it is in the service of public safety. Is it in the service of solidarity? As people of faith, that is how we must judge it. If it is not structured to give us back to one another, even after grave harm and violation, it is a structure of sin. And for this, our tradition says we need structures of solidarity in response. Prison ministry must be entered into with clarity about the nature of the system. When I enter a facility, I am constantly in tension because I reject the very premise upon which it is built. But I comply with its dictates so that I can draw close to the persons under its control. And I have to continually be on guard against falling into the false narrative that the divide is real. Prison ministers talk about presence and accompaniment because that is all it is about at the end of the day. I do not have anything very helpful to offer. I have not faced most of the tragedies and dilemmas that have marked the lives of the men and women I have met behind bars. I have heard far greater wisdom come from the mouth of a cellmate than my own. Prison ministry sees the constructed divisions and says no. I am there not because I am different, not because I have anything in particular to offer, but because I am the same, because we can all wear the ashes on Ash Wednesday, but we only see them if we draw close. Flawed but redeemable persons, all in the same place. So let me talk now a bit about virtue and the virtue of solidarity. It takes work to see through the eyes of solidarity. That is why the tradition talks about it as not just a principle, but a virtue. It is a habit that we have to practice, that we have to choose and be committed to each day. It is hard, endless work. I teach a course at Villanova on theology and criminal justice, and my students are given the opportunity to tutor or join a reading group with individuals who are incarcerated, at least up until last year. They learn something crucial when they do this that I simply cannot teach them in the classroom. They go behind bars and discover that they were not actually expecting to find human beings there. And you don't just flip a switch to overcome that unconscious expectation that these are not human beings. It requires constant practice, daily choices, repeated encounters. As Pope Francis says, not a sporadic act of generosity, but thinking and acting in terms of community over and over again. I see this so often with the language we unwittingly use. What do we imagine when we call someone a criminal? I asked a question at the start of my class, actually two. I say to the students, have you ever committed a crime? And if so, are you a criminal? And invariably, they say, well, I've maybe committed some crimes, but I'm not a criminal. What do we mean by that then, if not someone who's committed crime? There are deep presumptions there. Something that we might never be, but they are. What does it mean when we claim that someone is treating us as if we were a criminal? What does that mean? How do we reduce an entire person's existence to this? It is the same with words like thief, murderer, rapist. We have so many unquestioned habits and dispositions that need to be reformed, reshaped, even in the way we speak. And this is part of the work of prison ministry, both to extricate these dehumanizing patterns and habits from my own way of speaking and being, and to offer a counter narrative to the message that incarcerated persons hear over and over again, that they are irrevocably broken, that they are hopeless, that they, frankly, are trash. Sometimes we say the people are trash because of where they were born, and reality is they've had to survive something out of their control. But sometimes we give this message because of really, truly terrible things that they've done. But aren't we Christians? Don't we believe in a God whose love and mercy is stronger than the most awful things we do to another? It's an easy platitude to agree to in the abstract, but in practice, we are hypocrites all the time. A person who steals is not trash. A person who kills, who murders, is not trash. A person who rapes is not trash. It's hard to say these things because there's a story out there that makes us think that any mercy or humanity shown to someone who harms is a violation of their victims, their survivors. But don't buy that story. We can vigorously reject harm without having to take sides between so-called undeserved harm and deserved harm. It all must be rejected. We are called to live out a far more complex and challenging story, and that story is the gospel. Our ability to see so-called criminals as disposable, to give them up to suffering, says more about our sinfulness than theirs. And this is clearly true when we think about our hostility based on race and poverty. And I want to speak briefly about race in particular, and you can advance to the next slide, Lacey. This is just one of many graphs that capture the outrageous racial disparities that we have in our incarceration system. And I think it's important to note what this is connected to. And there's something that Michelle Alexander says in The New Jim Crow that is very helpful. She talks about the symbolic production of race, and she notes what this looks like over time. That in the past, what it looked like to be Black was to be a slave. And then after that, what it meant to be Black in Jim Crow was to be a second-class citizen. But today, with statistics like what you see before you, with mass incarceration, what Blackness means is criminality. That is the meaning that we have forged, that we have conflated, that we have perpetuated. And so this is particularly disturbing because, and as she notes, when these prior understandings of Blackness were functioning with exploitation and subordination, it still mattered that people were around. But mass incarceration functions through marginalization, which may in some ways be more dangerous, because when you're marginalized, you're no longer needed. And so thinking about the way that we have been able to facilitate this deep connection between the racism in our society and these ideas about what criminality is, it's a huge invitation to our work of solidarity. And the call to anti-racism speaks to the active daily work that we must do for the virtue of solidarity. It's not just about one-time condemnation, but the daily efforts to eradicate this, to resist the deeply ingrained messages that there is an us and a them, that some are worthy and some are unworthy, that some are inherently threatening. And as a white woman from a very privileged background, I have to be conscious of the ways that my presence and attempts at ministry can perpetuate rather than challenge the systemic racism and hostility to the poor. I have to find ways that my presence can disrupt the sinful narratives, and do this over and over again. One simple way is my habit of language. You can advance here. I try to refuse to speak of someone as a criminal. I try to speak simply of persons who are incarcerated. I even try to avoid the word prisoner and inmate because I don't think that they capture humanity, but obscure it. And in the next slide, you can see this quote where a formerly incarcerated person pleads that we stop using all these other languages about people who are incarcerated and simply use the language of people. We're asking everyone, he says, to stop using these negative terms and to simply refer to us as people. People currently or formerly incarcerated, people on parole, people recently released from prison, people in prison, people with criminal convictions, but people. It makes a difference. I try not to use the term correctional facility either, because this is not what they are. These are constant habits that I try to forge. And there are other habits too that I am invited into by virtue of the communion services I lead. Next slide. I look into the faces of men and women of my community who are largely demonized and abandoned. And I say over and over again in those communion services, the body of Christ, the body of Christ, the body of Christ. But it takes those encounters over and over again to internalize that message. The virtue of solidarity is hard won, but we have a God who invites us into rituals of hope and liberation. So next slide. What can we do? We need to reconsider our beliefs about the inevitability of prisons, about the marginalization that it imposes supposedly for our best interests and safety. And there is no better way to do this than to make the walls as porous as possible. As long as there are prisons in our name, I think everyone should find a way to be in them at some point. But now that is an impossible recommendation. So let me lift up a few other ways to live solidarity here. And next is, of course, Ministries of the Augustine Defenders of the Rights of the Poor. And in particular, there are two to highlight: Mary, Mother of Captives, which of course facilitates a pen pal program, and as well as has a support group for families of the incarcerated. And I also want to name a Deodatus Ministry, which is providing this community of support and solidarity for those recently released, and even listening and reading the Voices from Prison and the Edge newsletter, and finding ways to open ourselves regularly to these stories and these voices. Another pen pal program is from the Order of Malta, is another place to look. The correspondence, the relationship, presence, accompaniment, even if it cannot be physical at this time. In the next slide, I list a number of other organizations that in this area that are doing very important work of solidarity, activism and advocacy through Decarcerate Pennsylvania, challenging different policies, attempting to center the voices and vision of those who are incarcerated in the leadership, helping to show the path for that movement. The Pennsylvania Prison Society, keeping in contact with folks in prisons across this state and attempting to find ways to keep the system accountable for the conditions and the access that the persons incarcerated have. The Delco Coalition for Prison Reform is doing wonderful work trying to deprivatize the George W. Hill Correctional Facility, which is the only private prison in Pennsylvania. We have participatory defense hubs, which are working to humanize those who are navigating the criminal justice system, trying to create a more nuanced picture of who they are and who they are in the community. I was able to participate in one of the youth defense hubs, contributing to a film for a young man who was trying to make a case that incarcerating him would serve no one, given the work that he was doing. And I'm happy to report that effort, which involved a large number of people, was successful. But it takes the work to tell stories, and it takes the community to surround and be invested in one another. And there are many organizations working to support families of the incarcerated. Amachi is just one, which provides mentoring for children with incarcerated parents, and really being present to the family of those incarcerated is very significant. I know Father Paul has talked about the book of names of children that he keeps, and this is really such an important angle to understand. And in the next slide, some of the most painful statistics of mass incarceration in terms of the number of children at any given time, right? Not even cumulative, but that have a parent incarcerated. So we're talking about 1 in 28 children, and the racial disparities are gut-wrenching here. That 1 in 9 Black children at a given time has a parent incarcerated. So the unbelievable need to practice the virtue of solidarity, the thinking and acting in terms of community with these young members. I want to also highlight just briefly 2 other efforts that are happening, fairly recent ones, that I've been connected to in different ways. And in the next slide, you see the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition, which I've been a part of since it got off the ground in 2018, and is an effort to bring together resources for Catholic ministries that are not just in prison, but also working in post-release, and but trying to bring these together. There's so much fragmentation and lack of structure. And so in collaboration with the USCCB, the CPMC here has been developing standards for certifying prison ministers. There's actually right now pilot programs getting off the ground for the first round. And so based off of the CPE model that you would have for hospital chaplains, we're really starting to find ways to help train and develop one another. And just this site has both resources for people who are looking to get involved in ministry, as well as people who are looking to be ministered to receive ministry. And there's just a ton of resources and its own sort of series of webinars and trainings. So I encourage folks who may be interested or who know others interested to direct them to that, which is intended to be a clearinghouse as much as possible for everything in terms of Catholic ministry that affects those incarcerated. And I wanted to lift up this program in the next slide that one of the leaders of the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition, Joe Cotton, out in the West Coast, he's been involved with this One Parish, One Prisoner program. And this started, a number of different denominations came together to do this. And it began because of the realization that in Washington state, the number of prisoners, the number of people incarcerated in prisons, was equal to the number of churches. And so with that simple mathematical relationship, the idea was, what would it look like? What would it mean if each church took on the responsibility of forging a relationship, offering a welcoming community to each person incarcerated? And so this program has really developed an extraordinary 24-month series of modules that takes a parish community through a training where they will accompany someone who is currently incarcerated and approaching release, and then will provide the tools for that community to be a constant source of support and relationship upon release. And there's some really amazing stories that have been shared about what happens. One of them is a Catholic parish that was involved in this. There was a gentleman who they started to be connected with through this program as he was incarcerated. I believe he was had been involved in some gang activity. And initially the prison where he was located was rather close to the Catholic Church, but then he got transferred to a different facility that was 4 hours away. And that was quite burdensome, but the core group in that parish who were taking this work on still went and visited him 4 hours away. And then he got transferred clear across the state, and they still went and maintained that relationship. And then he got put in ICE custody for deportation. And the parish found an immigration attorney to help. And ultimately, he was deported. But in a final meeting that one of them was able to have with him before deportation, this man, he said, everyone was mourning the fact that he was being deported, but he said, but you have no idea what this has done for me. He couldn't believe that there was a community that would be willing to follow him 4 hours away and follow him across the state and follow him into ICE detention. And he said, I can trust again now, something he had never been able to do. And he's in Mexico right now, and that parish's relationship with him continues. There are some extraordinary examples of the ways that communities who are thinking and acting in terms of community are able to reach out and bring the kingdom of God to fruition. Here in Philadelphia, the body of Christ is separated by prison walls and barbed wire. And you can do the next slide, Lacey. And I wonder how we might worship differently to embody this, to note this, to mark this. I have dreams of being part of liturgies and prison parking lots so that we can feel more keenly this separation of the body. I have dreams of rituals of reception for those who have just been released, dreams of faith communities resisting the narrative that individuals can be removed from society. These men and women are part of our community, regardless of which side of the bars they are on. So as long as there are prisons, we are called to do the hard work, the Augustinian work of thinking and acting in terms of a community that is more powerful than concrete walls and barbed wire, a community that is more complex than oversimplified ideas about guilt and innocence, a community that is more than racialized notions of criminality. Every day we are called to enact over and over again the disposition, the virtue of solidarity that shows us that we belong to one another. Because over and over again, we have been shown that we belong to a God who is disposed to unfailing hope and liberation, with not a single one to be lost. And in this next slide, just a little coda from Pope Francis from Fratelli Tutti, reminding us that no one is expendable and that we have to make this daily decision of whether to be the Good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. So I thank you for letting me share these meditations. And I think now we're going to move into breakout rooms, I believe. And there's another slide. Oh, sorry, Lacey. There's one more slide that has just a few questions on it if they're helpful. There you go. And is there a way of talking about solidarity that particularly speaks to you? that you've heard. How might you or your faith community be receiving an invitation to act and think in greater solidarity with persons impacted by incarceration? What resistances may arise for you or for others? So just a few questions. If they're helpful, if they're not, please disregard them. And I think I'm going to turn things over to Lacey, who's going to put folks in a breakout room and encourage you to have conversation, and then I think we'll be returning to have a large group Q&A as it would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
By the time I'm done.
This one. Oh, good. Here they all come. And it gives them 60 seconds, so most people will start to come back. Yeah.
All right, good.
Father Gary, is that Boston behind you?
What's that? What was the question?
Oh, I
That's-
was wondering,
That's Staten Island, his place of origin.
is it?
Staten Island Ferry.
Oh, okay. All
There
right.
you go. There you go.
Literally my place of origin. I lived at the top of that hill.
Oh, how about that? Wow.
We are back.
Oh, good. Let's see. I think just a few people missing. Maybe? No, I think we're back. All right. So I think we're going to open up the floor to questions now. So anybody, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, ask a question, or you can feel free to send it in the chat.
Let's see, Kevin with his hand up.
Hi, how are you? Sorry. So I think it is a question, yeah. I loved the information that you presented. Thank you very much for all of that. I thought it was very well done. I absolutely agree. There's a solidarity issue that needs to be addressed, and prisons need to do better with the work that they're doing. We need to do better as society with the work that we're doing. I guess my question is around, I kind of get the impression that maybe you were saying that we might need to get rid of prisons. And I think my question is, then what do we replace that with? Because where I struggle, I think, is in removing prisons, which maybe that is a thing that needs to happen, because I see where you're coming from with the whole, building walls and excluding people is completely against solidarity. And I don't disagree with that. But there's also an element of justice that needs to be addressed in the fact that there is an action that occurred that violated somebody else or in some way, shape, or form, and that's the whole reason for this prison. And so if we remove the prison piece of it, which may increase the solidarity piece, I feel like there's something that needs to replace it in order to address the justice piece as well, if that makes sense. Absolutely.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, there's lots of things that I didn't have time to put in there, and I'm very glad you asked this question. So you have correctly identified that I identify as a prison abolitionist in terms of what I really think is. But that's, as you said, like that. In terms of what prison is, I don't think that there is really a way to do prison well. I think it's sort of beyond reform. But that doesn't. But when you talk about justice, it's because there's something that prison actually doesn't do what it needs to do, which is talking about accountability, right? And there's a Danielle Sered she does a lot of work, and she has a recent book, Until We Reckon, and she does a really beautiful job in that book of talking about the difference between accountability and punishment. And so accountability is essential. the passion of sort of solidarity is the same passion that absolutely has to condemn the ways that we brutalize each other, right? So whether it's a system brutalizing people in incarceration, or if it's individuals brutalizing people, it has to be condemned in no uncertain terms, right? But the issue is that we do that with accountability processes that look very different, I think, ought to look very different than what prisons do. And actually, like Sared will argue that prisons actually don't hold people accountable at all. Like you don't actually have to face the harm that you've done. You don't actually have to do anything, become anything different, right? As soon as we've sentenced you to prison, no one cares about what happens in prison to you. Like that's not part of whether we think justice is done. We think justice can be served by determining what sentence you get, which doesn't make any sense. Like, and if we really took accountability seriously, that wouldn't be true at all. So it actually requires, we're not going to get rid of prisons anytime soon, but I think what it requires is very intensive work, that looks like restorative justice work that holds people accountable in communities. Instead of having jury duty, to have duty around the country for people to be part of circles where you have intensive regular meetings. I mean, I think that there is still an issue of whether there are some individuals who are so dangerous potentially that they have to be confined in some way. I mean, that's a real conversation. It's a conversation about a very small minority of people compared to who we have in our system right now. So that should be held in its proper place. But there's a difference between confining someone because we don't know how to welcome them in our community in a way that everyone is safe, and saying that you need to be confined as a way of being punished. And so I think we have to be really careful to parse those out. So we absolutely have to deal with accountability. Accountability is part of solidarity, because you have to be honest about the ways that you violated a community to continue to function and flourish in a community. So there's a lot that you've pointed us to, and I didn't just, fill it out, but it's important work that has to be done to make sense of what I'm saying is here too. Thank you. Yeah. I see Chris Schwartz has his hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
In our breakout session, we had someone discussing incarceration and the recent case with Floyd, and how that officer ought to be incarcerated for the rest of his life. And fortunately, my microphone wasn't working. Otherwise, I probably would have screamed at him. But, it basically comes down to, until you have some entry into a jail or a prison where you can understand, as you said, that these people are people, that you don't realize how terrible what we're doing is. I mean, in my own case, I do mostly jail ministry. And when I go into jails, I say, how many of you are awaiting trial? And 85% are raising their hand. And I say to them, so what's the deal? Where's your swimming pool? I mean, you're a guest of the state. You're here not because you want to be, and you're not convicted of anything, and you're innocent until proven guilty. So why are you being treated like criminals? But that's what we do. I don't know whether it's that way in Pennsylvania, but certainly it's that way in Maryland.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I know that there are a number of people on this call who have, including yourself, who have a lot of experience. So I'm very honored to be in the presence of folks who've done a lot of this work, and have all those insights. I would just, you mentioned at the beginning, the verdict yesterday, and it's really, I think, it's a difficult thing to try to convey. But it was clear to me that there was no good resolution, because
right.
as you know, I completely understand the outrage, and there absolutely has to be accountability, and there absolutely has to be condemnation of what, of the murder and all the murders that we don't get to see and march for. But I also get so discouraged by when we know that this system is broken and we know that it's wrong and it brutalizes, and then for this moment, like it's this is the only thing we can imagine, and so we allow ourselves to celebrate that this is the answer and that justice has been done, and it's like and we lose ground, I feel like, in realizing how far we are from figuring out how to actually do justice. The same system that is finally showing some sense of accountability is still the same system that dehumanizes and brutalizes as a matter of course, and doesn't actually really hold people accountable. It just holds people. So it's a difficult moment to make sense of that, especially given the all the understandable emotions that have been built up to sort of this moment.
My question is in the chat.
Yeah, so this is, thanks, Michael, your question about what's to be done with people who have made bad decisions that have injured other people and effectively denied their solidarity with other members of the human race. Is there a penalty for their transgressions? Yeah, and I think certainly, so when I was speaking before about accountability is part of the answer to this. I think that there's another question that you bring up here, which is, what is the place of punishment? And I think about this, it's a difficult question theologically to make sense of. Punishment is typically defined as something that is against the will of the person, is unpleasant, is inflicted upon them, and with the desire, right, to communicate something about the harm, right, and usually it's couched in this notion of reformation, of a medicinal purpose. But the more I think about this through my theological lens, the harder it is for me to be sure that punishment actually serves the purpose. And part of this goes back to even like the ways that we interpret like what is happening on the cross, and is Christ paying a punishment, paying a debt, and therefore sort of reinforcing the validity of punishment, or is Christ saying, putting an end to punishment as a path to reconciliation? And part of that for me is sometimes we focus so much on like a penal atonement idea, right? That we're saying that all we really need is Good Friday, but we don't. We need Easter, right? We need something that shows that there is something more powerful than sin and punishment. I know, like, this is, I think, and this is why I wanted to ask that question about resistance, because I think that, I'm trying to push us in a direction that is really hard to handle for anyone who has been violated or has seen people being violated, right? There's real outrage. But it's, for me, it goes back to sort of what does a nonviolent approach look like? Like, how do we handle violence non-violently? How do we handle harm non-violently? Because I do believe that is what we are called to out of the gospel. And talking about nonviolence, there's a famous sort of very easy small thing about the two hands of nonviolence, right? With one hand, you say no to everything that is a violation of the person, and with the other hand, you reach out an invitation. And so I feel like you can't just do one or the other, right? And they both have to be a part of it. And figuring out how to translate that is crucial. And I think that's what maintains the solidarity. We actually violate solidarity if we only give an invitation and pretend as if things have not happened. But we also violate solidarity if we only focus on the rejection and not figuring out how to maintain that invitation. I mean, it's really not humanly possible work, I think, ultimately. Like, it is only by the grace of God that we could possibly come to continue to welcome people who gravely harm. But I mean, I think that is the model we are being shown. Like, there's just, I can say it confidently when I go into prisons and do community services that I believe there's nothing that anyone in that room, including myself, has done that is more powerful than God's love. So we have to try to live that.
Kathryn?
Yes.
Paul Morrissey, Philadelphia. A couple memories stick in my mind that connect with this, certainly don't answer with this profound question you're dealing with. When we were there in 2005 or 6, the commissioner of France's prisons, the prisons in France, came over to visit us. And you know what one of his first questions was at the Philadelphia prison? Where are the soccer fields? We went, what? His point was, what are you doing here to rehabilitate these people? I mean, that was just one little example, right? Physicality. Otherwise, you just lock them up and you let them out in 10 years and nothing's grown. Another one was an example out in San Quentin prison. They had a training program out there. And I remember this, there was like something called circles of accountability for the inmates. And I want to make a case for this if I'm not really off the rails here. There's maybe a purpose for constraining people who've done something wrong. This is in answer to Michael Dennis, constraining people, but not necessarily like punishing them. What do you do when they're under constraint? Well, one of the things they had was these circles of accountability where they would have the mother of a victim, a murder victim, came into this gathering. These people have been doing this for like 20 weeks. And we sat in there for a couple sessions of all these guys, they happen to be guys in a circle, 20 of them, who had a murder conviction. And they listened to her. And I guess they told some of their own stories, but they had to listen to the pain she had. And here's one exercise they did, which to me is an example of inviting them to change. They had to stand up at a blackboard and write down all of the people after they heard her that they thought might be affected by their crime. There were hundreds of names they wound up, and groups of people they realized they had harmed by the act of murdering somebody. And that alone was astonishing for them and us all. So I'm just saying there are many ways you could use a period of constrainment for people that are harming people or dangerous and not simply punish them.
Absolutely. Thanks, Father Paul. I'm so glad you're on this call. And I mean, and that's exactly right. I mean, I think, I'm a mother of 3 young children. And so like the question about like punishment and being upset when they do things, I have to face this all the time, and sometimes I do better than others. But my children don't really learn or make the right move because I'm angry at them. Like if I am to punish them, if I impose something negative on them, I mean, the most that's going to do is create fear and avoidance, but it's not going to actually make them understand why they shouldn't hit their brother on the head, right? So, what you said, Father Paul, is exactly right. Like the transformation, the invitation that we all need, right, to do the right thing comes from those lists of all the people impacted because they love them, because they, it comes from our love, not from our fear, right? It comes from who we want to be and who we want to be with rather than what we need to avoid and be afraid of. And so we have to create the space for that. And and the prison system as it stands right now is the antithesis of the space for that. I mean, sometimes it can happen, but it when it happens in spite of the system. I mean, I've seen it happen, and it's always about the relationships that people have that they value that bring them to something different, but that's typically something that happens in spite of their surroundings and the structure that they're in. But I think that that's a really helpful example that you brought up to us. So thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions there? Anyone wants to jump in? Well, seeing or hearing none, I just want to again thank Kathryn for a very fine presentation, insightful and very helpful, I think, in trying to look at all the various elements of solidarity and imprisonment and all those very tough issues that we face. So once again, on behalf of everybody, thank you very much, Kathryn. We really appreciate it. I have one announcement. Our next webinar is on May 19th at 7:30, and we're going to have a discussion of the Bishop's Pastoral on Racism, Open Wide Our Hearts. We'll have some more information out during this next week on that particular presentation. So once again, thank you all, and God bless. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul Maloney from Australia.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Take care.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you, Kathryn. Very nice.